another episode of Speaking Legally, where the legal meets the cultural. We are so glad that you are able to join us again for another episode, and we appreciate all the feedback that you've been giving as well when it comes to the information. So it's not just looking at what's happening in real time, but actually getting an opportunity for us to have some tactical ways we can deal with it. You have two experts here as the two of the co-hosts for Speaking Legally, Edward Pichardo, Esquire, and Royce Russell, Esquire. So there's a lot going on in the world right now, gentlemen. We're going to jump in after you say hello to the audience and just kind of process what we're seeing happening in real time. There's a lot of legislation that has been prompted as a result of the outcry of the people coming from the protest and coming from all of the various things that we are seeing happening in 2020 that a lot of people have been working on for a while, but now is the time where folks are paying attention and actually being challenged to take action. So I'll turn it over to you first, Ed, to say hello, and then to Royce, and then we're going to jump into today's conversation.
Hello, everyone. Hola, todo el mundo. My name is Edward Pichardo, Esquire. I'm a solo practitioner, New York City-based attorney. Welcome to Legally Speaking, where the cultural meets the legal. Honored to have you here today.
Awesome.
Hello.
And over to you, Royce.
Hello, everybody. Royce Russell here. We're going to chop it up a minute here. We're going to talk about these reforms once again, whether or not they're really reforms. And then, we had what we call, you might have caught a little bit of it, what we call the pre-takes, where we talk about some of the subject matters that we want to talk about. And in the midst of doing that, we went live. And right at the moment that we went live, I realized that we cannot leave this segment without talking about the mighty movement in the first place. We can't leave the intro without Ed and his background. You got a band with you, Ed? Is that the deal?
No, I'm trying to turn down this volume.
You walk with music. You the chaff. You walk with music, huh? So, one of the things that we can't skip over, and that is the latest news that is cultural and legal. Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about speaking legally, where the culture and the legal meet, and where the legal and the culture meet. And I have to take my hat off and tip it to all the assistant district attorneys in the Bronx that are standing up and saying no more. We want true leadership in this county. We want police that are abusive to the citizens in the county to be prosecuted. And they're saying that despite the fact that the DA herself has been quiet on this whole issue, District Attorney Darcel Clark. So now you have those that are in the forefront of the battle, urging their quote unquote leaders to take a stand and be accounted for. Leaders lead, they don't react. And right now, you seeing reaction and not leadership. But we're going to put that on the back burner because that's a hot button for me, because I'm from the Boogie Down St. Mary's Projects, 156th Street and Jackson Avenue. That's where I hail. You know what I mean? And I said last week, and I'll say it again. I was bad on the court, and I'm even badder in court. So let's go with the fifth grade, because Ed, there's some things that you wanted to shout out. I'm not going to be the Stephen A of this show, but let's get to shouting.
Well, we've had a number of laws that have been enacted or passed or repeals in the legislature recently in response to the George Floyd killing. We're talking about the repeal of 50A having to do with the disclosure of police officer personnel records. Keep in mind that it's not only police officers. We're talking about corrections officers. We're talking about firefighters also. So, before the repeal, all these different occupations had their personnel records, protected by this law, where it was very difficult to get access to these records and find out which officers are the ones that had, several incidents of or allegations of misconduct or discipline. Then you got the STAT Act, which requires courts to compile and publish racial and demographic data for all offenses. So that was a change in the judiciary law. There's already, legislation that requires some level of reporting, data, how many incidents. So it remains to be seen, what type of major change this law is going to have. Then you got the biggie, or not so much the biggie, but one of the ones that kind of shines pretty much is a change in the executive law requiring the reporting of the discharge of a firearm within 6 hours, verbal report to a supervisor, and then a written report within 48 hours. The legislation, the law that was enacted, still has a line stating that the officer is allowed to avail themselves of their constitutional protection against self-incrimination, which I'm sure the PBA is going to take advantage of in those incidents.
Well, let me back you up for a second. Let's go back, because you ran through a couple of things, and I believe in human bites, and so I don't want anybody to skip class. We're going to start with the first one. So repeat what you said, the first 50A new innovative realization that the wonderful mayor in New York has had. Now, I also want to let everybody know that we have listeners across the board, right, in every single state. So we're focusing on New York because we're getting a lot of information from that city and from that state. I don't know what other states are doing. Call in, write in, let us know. We'll analyze it, we'll chop it up. But in New York, what is happening is that the 50A has prevented certain disciplinary records from being exposed publicly. Now, I believe what Ed has said before is that now there's going to be some transparency, and we'll be able to see that. When I say we, I mean the public will be able to see it. We should know that practitioners like myself and like Ed, who try these type of cases, who litigate these type of cases, we always had access to the disciplinary records. However, we will be under protective order not to expose it to the public. We can only use it at trial. And so now the jury of your peers now really becomes something that is literally, and not just figuratively true, but literally true, because now people in the community will know as much as the litigators know. And that's important, because there shouldn't be a hijacking or a character assassination that we have seen when people of color are victimized. The playing field should be even. And so now this is somewhat has set the playing field somewhat evenly. And I believe that was the first thing that they tried, or they're reforming as far as 58. Am I correct, Ed?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Previously, we had access to the information, but it was of course subject to a protective order, only allowing the parties to the litigation to know about it, and then be prohibited from revealing that information to anyone that was outside of that litigation. The proponents of this complete repeal of 50A have pointed out that because the police unions were arguing, oh, now you're going to be able to get an officer's home address and harass them at home, when in fact, it's still a governmental record that is under the protection in any event of the Freedom of Information law, which means that if you need to get information on a record that's otherwise public, you need to do a formal request. So that process is still in place. And during that process, that governmental agency is allowed to review the request and then possibly redact certain items. So, but at the end of the day, it's still a refreshing development with respect to transparency and disclosure. And the other side of this too is not only as somebody practicing, say, in a civil rights action, but with with the discovery law that went into effect this year before this, if you were representing someone accused of a crime and the arresting officer had some misconduct on the record or something that could arise during a trial that came through in discovery, or that's revealed to the defense attorney even before this repeal of 50A.
One of the things
before you go into that, Royce, just a quick question. You said it was the police officers, and who else this affected?
Because this law also previously covered firefighters and correction officers as well, and I believe peace officers too.
And you don't hear that mentioned in the repeal part, and that we need to keep our eye on that. But one of the things that happened to me yesterday, I was on the phone for a very, very long time, and I'm trying not to be Dennis the Doubter here. I was on the phone with a good friend, Joanne Hill. I'm gonna shout her out because we were on the phone for about an hour and a half, and she was marching through, how it was happy days and happy times in New York City because of these reforms and because of the new virus that's in the air. And the virus is pro-Black that is in the air. And we come to the agreement that if it's just about momentum in the movement, then we're going to fall flat on our face. It can't be a movement. It has to be a life change. It has to be about life. Because movements come and go, and momentum comes and goes. And when we're left with movements and momentum, then that means we're left with a beginning and an end. This should be the beginning, and there should be no end. And for every time there's a reform, we need to critically look at that as people of color and not just take it for what it is. It seems like a great thing, but really look at it. For instance, this is not part of what is written on 50A, but the disbanding of the street crime unit that most people lay their hands on, of all the excessive force and all the abuse come from street crime unit. We mean 1,100 cases that are now pending against the New York City Police Department is all street crime. I beg to differ. Now, most people would say, hooray, 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 we're dismantling the street crime unit, and so therefore our troubles are all gone. That's a checker move. See, we haven't heard from Pat Lynch, who's running the strings behind. I say while we're sleeping, they're thinking. And when I say they, I mean de Blasio, I mean the commissioner, and I mean Patrick Lynch. They're thinking while we're sleeping. There's no way that somebody jumped up because of some death that happened to one of our brothers in Minnesota. And even though we've been marching in the street 20-something days, 30-something days, assuring 365 days that we've seen in our history when it comes down to revolution, that all of a sudden they're going to dismantle the street crime unit, and that's a victory for us.
And it's amazing that you mentioned that, Royce, because some people don't realize that New York City has one of, if not the largest police force in the country. I would imagine that there may be some slight numerical differences between LA and Chicago, but certainly New York is one of the largest police forces in the country, larger than the military of many countries in the world. And I believe it numbers at around 38,000 officers. And what we're talking about in terms of the street crime unit, we're talking about maybe 600 officers from the last time. And I looked out of 38,000, and we're not mentioning, and I'm thinking, okay, that sounds good, but are you removing all plainclothes cops? Talking about all detectives as well? What are we talking about?
So,
and of course, they mention this idea of, this is risky and it could backfire on us, but it's a risk we're willing to take. Like, really now.
Ed, and let me add to it. The reason why they threw in the risk part, right, is because that's the shaking the finger at the Black and brown community part that says, okay, we're going to do this. And when it backfires, we're going to say, we told you so. Now, Stacy, I see you jumping at the bit, but I know you're a critical thinker like myself. And critically thinking, I don't know if, I may want the cancer localized. I may not want the cancer to spread all over my body. So now you take these 600 officers and you say, hey, look, we're not going to localize them. We're going to decentralize them. We're going to let them run. So now the 600, as that commercial goes, you tell two friends and they'll tell two friends, and so on and so on and so on. So that street crime unit officer that has 10 years on the job, 5 years, 7 years, 8 years on the job, who do you think he's being teamed up with? He ain't being teamed up with a veteran of 20 or 15 or 16 years. He's being teamed up with a rookie, someone that got 2, 3, 4 years under the belt. And what you think that street crime officer is teaching that young buck how to do and how to police? Now that street crime officer now has touched two friends, and they're going to touch two friends, and his partner's going to touch two friends, and so on and so on and so on. So we really have to look critically. I'm not saying that, oh my God, you know what, here go Dennis the Doubter, but we need to look at that and understand what that means. So now when your kid runs up to the police officer in the uniform, see, here's the deal. Some people in some communities, they know what street crime looks like. They in a certain car, they got certain tinted windows, they walk with a certain walk, you can't see their badge and shield, they got a certain arrogance about them, don't have a lot of tolerance, and they come with a whole lot of aggression. And if you live in certain communities, you know what that looked like. You've seen the KKK with a sheet on, you know what that looked like. But what happens when that person takes the hood off and throws on a suit? What happens when they throw on a uniform? What happens when you think you run into the officer that's your neighborhood officer, the officer that you should know, or you think, all right, this ain't a street crime, undercover officer, I'm running to this officer in a uniform, and da-da, surprise, surprise. The person you run into is the person that just came off a street crime unit, and he has no good intentions. I mean, that's the symbolism that they're trying to portray the street crime unit, whether fact or fiction. But now you tell me they're dispersed and now they're in uniforms, and you made some of them detectives. See, I couldn't jump with Joanne and have a happy day. I wanted to, but I couldn't. It just wasn't that happy. And we need to know, and that's why we're here.
Well, and I just want to underscore that because you're talking about what everybody's seeing in the media. So you see this potentially good thing, but nobody knows the amount of officers because they didn't publicize how many officers were on. And as you told us, 600. So thank you for sharing that, because we need to see everything in its context, right? And when we talk about the legal meeting the cultural, what does that mean for us? What does that mean in our community? So you just started breaking down 58, but there's more that has happened and more that we need to unpack. So Ed, you want to keep unpacking that so that everybody can understand in layman's terms what's really going on with these sweeping reforms that we're all celebrating.
And just briefly, para la comunidad latina, estamos hablando de la eliminación de una ley que protegía los récords personales de muchos policías, porque cuando estaba esa ley en existencia, el público no tenía acceso a saber qué conducta o qué disciplina había sufrido ciertos policías o si tenían incidentes de abuso, y ahora sí hay más transparencia. Vamos a ver qué va a ser el efecto de eso y si va a ser real. Y también estamos hablando de removiendo 600 policías de 38,000 que hay, del detalle que bregaba con crimen en la calle. Y nosotros pensamos que eso de verdad no es un cambio real y vamos a esperar a ver qué efecto eso tiene también. But, to continue talking about, I agree with Royce, we have to look at a lot of these reforms and decide whether or not they're real reforms, see what the actual effect is, the context, the implementation, because some of these laws that have been implemented, we got to see what the implementation is. Like, for instance, the next one, the STAT Act, requiring courts to compile and publish racial and other demographic data on low-level offenses. It's a change in the judiciary law. It, allows the chief administrator to create forms to collect this data. there are already a number of reports that are required annually. In many cases, the reports aren't produced annually. They're produced for a series of years. You ask for them. It's hard to compel the agency to produce them. Sometimes the agency will say, hey, listen, I don't have enough personnel or I don't have enough resources to get this data compiled. And then you ask yourself, well, we got all this data. What are we going to do with it at the end of the day? What happens when the administration changes and it becomes a more conservative administration that doesn't care whether or not these reports actually get published? So I definitely worry about these reforms and whether they're really real or not.
I don't give a shit about a report, really. I don't give a shit about a report. What I care about and what you care about and what my client cares about, if that person is a person of color and if that person is not. They want to know whether or not that officer has a tendency to lie, point blank. I want that stat. Let's start taking down names and numbers of folks that get up on the stand and they lie as to probable cause why they stop people. They lie as to what was the chain of events that took place. Look, as we're talking, I was doing the research prior and during. My hands are moving. And I looked at some of the things that de Blasio has put forth, right? And some of the things he said is that we're going to establish that any officer, if they're charged with any excessive force or any misconduct, we're going to establish what happened at the trial. No, you're not establishing what happened at the trial. What you're going to do is you're going to establish whether or not he was found liable or not and what the amount is. Establishing what happened at the trial is establishing that the officer went up there and the jury didn't believe him and therefore he was lying. And if he lied about this, why aren't we tracking him? Because he may lie about something else in the future, or he may have lied about something else in the past. And that is the thing that directly affects our community. I want to know, as you sit there in criminal court, that if a judge decides that they're going to suppress, what I mean by suppress everyone, that means throw a gun out, throw anything, any contraband that the police may find illegally on your person or in your home, or may arrest you for based upon probable cause. If the judge finds that probable cause didn't exist, that there's an officer that circumvented the Constitution, didn't dot the I, didn't cross the T, then that name should be down and everybody should know it. If we're talking about that, and if we're talking about not allowing that officer to come back in the courtroom to testify against someone else, then I'm all for it. Transparency 100%. I'm jumping with Joanne in the puddle. But if we ain't talking about that, if we talking about it being in some book somewhere, then all we doing is talking about bullshit on another day. And that's what we getting.
And I think you're hitting on the problem. What do we do after we find out about the misconduct? What do we do after complaints are verified? Are we going to remove that officer? Are we going to demote that officer? Or are we simply going to say, hey, don't do it again. Let me give you some retraining and let you get back out on the street and hurt other people? Where is the accountability there, other than providing people with notice of what this officer has done? I mean, there should come to a point that if an officer racks up enough complaints, violations, verified misconduct, that now this person is more clearly subject to removal, of course, respecting whatever civil service due process rights they may have. But at the end of the day, given the awesome responsibility that these officers are endowed with, they just can't be allowed to continue to, quote unquote, run the streets and continue with the same conduct again and again. And in some cases, being rewarded. I mean, you got some officers, I guess, that are looked at as the, tough guys that we need out on the tough streets for these tough assignments, instead of, incentivizing the good officers who are doing what they need to do and not racking up complaints because they're courteous to civilians. They identify themselves. They tell the civilians that they encounter exactly why they're being stopped, and and so forth, and treating them like the citizens they are and the human beings that they are. So I agree with you.
And let me say it in another way, real brief, is that maybe the reform should be focused on uplifting the people that you just said. That means that if some officer on the force intervenes and says, "Hey, look, you're abusing that person. You're being discourteous. You're using too much excessive force. What are we doing about the NYPD 12 that wouldn't participate in quotas? What are we doing about those people? Where's the incentive for those people that intervene? Because that's what we're asking. We're asking for infiltration and intervention that intervenes. Where is their support? That is where the reform should be focused on as well. How do we support those that are willing to put on Front Street the bad actors financially, no retribution, no retaliation? Now that's a win-win. That means people of color who then join the force will know that they have what I call the Verizon network behind them in order to do good. And when I say that because that's the critical thinking and the critical reading between the lines. And as we push and reform, we need to always think outside of the box. And let me just say one more thing. The mayor in New York 5 hours ago said that the public would know within 48 hours officers' names if they're involved in what they call substantial injury cases to a civilian, that the public would know that officer's name if that officer is fully suspended. And what he meant by that, and he said badge and gun taken away and fully suspended. That sounds good. That sounds really good. Who's defining substantial injury? That's my first question. So that means you only giving me information when someone has been fully suspended. That means their badge and gun is taken from them. How many times does that happen? 0 to none. See, he's not talking about modified. You put somewhere else, you still have your badge and gun, but you're in the inventory room. Your badge and gun has to be taken, and then information will be given forward, right? And then he says that may not happen in 48 hours if a DA gets involved. Well, I mean, what DA? Well, let me not say that. It's apparent that in the Bronx, that DA is getting involved. But what DA is not going to get involved if there's substantial injury to a civilian to the level where someone's badge and shield is being suspended? What DA is not getting involved? I mean, excluding what we know about was written in the Daily News today about Bronx prosecutors standing up for themselves. Gonzalez is going to stand up. Vance is going to stand up. Everybody else is what? So we may never even get to that. We may not even get to that. And he says that in 2 weeks, the Internal Affairs Bureau has to come back with a finding. That sounds good, but here's the downfall to that. What is IAB going to say? We couldn't get everything done in 2 weeks. So therefore, our report is incomplete, or we find it unsubstantiated because we didn't get a chance to interview everyone. Or what happens is the 2 weeks is not really 2 weeks. The 2 weeks is really 4 weeks in order to get that vital information. We have to make sure that we don't fall for the 52 pump fake okie doke. We have to.
Well, and there's more to go through, right? Because you only started at the beginning and we kind of rolled it back, Ed, so that you can explain what people are hearing. Let's get to the next one before, we're out of time, because we're rolling through this. We want to break it down once again, where the legal meets the cultural, understanding that while things sound good, there's some other pieces to it that we might want to make sure we know about.
Well, we also have this change in the executive law that requires the reporting of discharges of a firearm within 6 hours, a verbal report to a supervisor, and within 48 hours, a written report. And as I mentioned earlier, it explicitly, and it's like, weren't these guys already required to report this incident already in less than 6 hours? As soon as the damn thing happens, you're supposed
There you go.
On that radio.
That's my concern. Why would it take 6 hours?
And check it out. As a former assistant district attorney, guess who's on the scene and can't get contact to? Right? And depending upon where your allegiance is as a district attorney, guess what? You might fall for the okie doke and go there and line up on the wrong side. Start protecting the officer who fired the firearm, right? And start, not doing your job, which should be a truth finder, a fact finder. So we all know that their Sixth Amendment right is still going to come into play, that they're going to be able to get an attorney, and the union's still going to be called, and the union's still going to be what we call blocking the progress or blocking justice. So what are we really saying here, man? Is it just words coming out of my mouth?
So yeah, that 6 hours confused me because I thought something like that happened. Shouldn't you call like right away?
Now let's play devil's advocate here in terms, or rather on the side of the advocates here. I think they will argue that this is more directed towards those officers who say are off duty, discharge the weapon, and then it takes a while, I guess, for them to get around to reporting it.
Is there any language in that document that says off duty?
I'd have to take another look at it.
Let me tell you, brother. There is no language that says off duty. I don't even want you to even go. You can go make yourself a bowl of cornflakes before you go look that up. There is nothing in there that says off duty. All right, because if that was an issue, it would have been highlighted. That's a good point there. Off duty. That's an A++ E for effort. You think somebody would have left that on the table and not mention that? It doesn't exist. I want to know what's up with the body cams. I'm hearing that body cam material is supposed to be turned over within 30 days. That's what I want to know. I mean, look, I have cases out there, wrongful death cases, that there's been no prosecution and we've gone over a year. And in a borough where it's predominantly Black and Latino people. And is known as the Boogie Down. You name the borough, it's the Bronx, right? So where's the body cam footage? So if any of these reforms are going to come into place, it better not be any language that says prospective and not retroactive, because that's the language that we should be looking for as people fighting for reform. What is prospective and what is retroactive? And you don't be surprised if you read the law and it says it says prospective. It don't say retroactive starting from this day forward.
Or doesn't mention either term and is legally interpreted to mean going forward as of the time of enactment.
Right, and not going backward. And let me tell you, that's the biggest bomb we could drop for today, right here. The definition of retroactive and prospective when it comes down to this reforms. And I would say it again, retroactive means cases whether they were filed last year or the year before, or whether they're filed as of today. You get everything. You get the footage, you get the 30 days, whether it's the body cam, you get the disciplinary records, we can make it public. Or if it's prospective, that means only cases that start tomorrow or start when the law is enacted. And then that doesn't do any, look, here I go. I don't want to be Dennis the doubter. It does do some good. But there are, as the mayor said, there's 1,100 cases in the pipeline already. And he said he's going to make that public, all 1,100 of it. And I like the fact that he said that there's going to be a database that contains the 1,100, tells you what happened in 1,100 in reference to the trial. Hopefully he'll tell you some information about those to settle. And it'll have the disciplinary records in there as well. That could be useful.
That's very useful. That's 1,100 cases. That's 1,100 lives and families that are affected by this. And let's be real. We're in a time where everybody is scrambling to do something. At least in New York, between the governor enacting certain things, the mayor enacting certain things, we can dissect what they all mean and still hold them accountable for any additional action that needs to be required. But at least there's some action, because there's places around our country right now that are not doing anything and are not even acknowledging the fact that there is a problem, because some people feel that there's absolutely nothing wrong and everything is fine as is. So we really want to highlight the fact that at least we can have this discussion and we can continue to hold them to task on the additional pieces that might be left out of some of this sweeping reform. So Ed, you want to keep breaking it down for today? We're not going to get through everything, but the highlights that everybody is watching.
Let me just add one thing. I'm sorry, Ed. Let me add one thing, Stacey, and it's to your point. I think that's why it's critical for us to understand that we can't talk in terms of movement and momentum. We have to talk in terms of life, right? Because movement and momentum is like passion in a marriage. Passion comes and goes, but love stays. Commitment always stays. And so if we're committed and we're not worried about a movement and we're not worried about momentum and we stay, not that we can't take advantage of it, not that we shouldn't take hold of it, not that as people call me and say, yo, Royce, this is your time, you should be making them. No, it's about the marathon and not the sprint. And we need to stay consistent with that. And that'll make the difference between having a reform today and refining it tomorrow, drilling down on it 2 days from now to make it where we want it to be. And that's what we have to do.
And para la comunidad latina, mucho de lo que estamos hablando es si estos cambios en la ley van a tener el efecto deseado, porque, por ejemplo, hablé más temprano de una ley que va a requerir que los cortes colecten información sobre la raza de la persona, la etnicidad, si son hispanos o no, y otra información que indica de dónde vienen. Y la verdad es que muchos de nosotros ya estamos cansados de todo esto reporte y queremos ver acción. También hubo un cambio en la ley que requiere que el policía, si usa el fusil o tira un tiro o tiros, que se tiene que reportar al supervisor verbalmente entre 6 horas y después que tiene que ver un reporte escrito en 48 horas. La verdad es que ya hay muchas regulaciones que requieren que el policía dé un reporte cada vez que haya un incidente de violencia. So, 6 horas y 48 horas, ¿qué va a hacer eso? Si va a tener efecto o no. The other item that I wanted to mention was, and I don't know if you were aware of this, Royce, or if you saw it on the news, they're talking about they removed cops from the DA's offices to put them on protest duty. And some people are looking at that as retaliation for the DA's deciding to charge officers for several incidents that occurred during these protests.
I'm sure that's what they're doing.
Wow.
I'm sure that's the retaliation. One of the things that is happening in New York, and this goes coincides with what you're saying, is that there's this organization called the ECRB, Elected Civilian Review Board.
Yes, I heard about
it. I know, Brother Barron is behind that, and who is it? Inez from Harlem, right? She's behind it, and
from Brooklyn as well.
Councilman from Brooklyn as well. And they have their posts. They have their hand right on the pulse. Having elected positions instead of appointed positions, elected review board instead of appointed positions. That is how you get constant, not only constant change, but that's how the community stays involved. That's how the community remains, interactive with what's going on. And that's a movement for us to really look at, because it's sad to say, let me backtrack. 2 things. 1, we should never need a special prosecutors are doing their job. But if we are going to have a special prosecutor, then I don't know if it should be an appointed person. Maybe it should be an elected person. Maybe it should be a person that people in the community, in communities, Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, name it, Manhattan, feel that this is the person that's going to do right. Because if it is an appointed position, just like we look at de Blasio's task force, there's some names that belong there. And there's some names that I'm like, all right, okay. And there's some names that are missing. And what I mean by names are missing, there are people that are in the street like you, Ed. There are people that's in the street like other attorneys and other people that are on the legal side that are not part of this equation, that will tell you that what you're trying to devise is not going to work. And this is why it's not going to work. I'm all for calling in the big guns. And we can look at Atlanta as an example. I'm all for calling in the big guns. But when you call in the big guns, whether it's Crump, whether it's anybody else that comes in that has a national microphone, you come in to help the person that's on the playing field already, that knows, like Brother Stewart in Atlanta, that knows the ins and outs of those courtrooms, who has tough cases and they death cases. And you come and you support that person and you pass the mic to that person and you let that person use your platform to articulate the pains that are going on in Atlanta and the pains that are going on in Minnesota and the pains that are going on in New York City. Is a collective microphone that's going to get us to where we need to be. And that's why the ECRB is right on the pulse of it. I'm telling you, is right on the pulse. And there's other organizations, Until Freedom, CPR for all the work that they're doing. Justice Committee is doing all the work that they're doing. Cop Watch, who's on the street getting the footage for all the work they're doing. National Action Network, who's, has a group huddle, who's out there educating the young folks. 100 Blacks in law enforcement officers that are retired, that serve as experts and serve to the betterment of their community. The list can go on. But, I got the platform, so I just couldn't, I would be remiss if I didn't name those names.
No. Listen, I agree with you. We definitely need to go to an elective versus an appointed route. I mean, we know that the Civilian Complaint Review Board is full of appointees from different branches of the city government representing those appointing officials' interests, and the people, really don't get heard the way they should. They don't have the independence that they need to make the tough calls, especially in these incidents. Another one that I wanted to mention was there was a change, an amendment in the civil law requiring officers to provide medical and mental health attention to individuals in custody, and creating a right of action in that respect. Whether it's a creation of a right of action is a little questionable, because I would imagine in the many circumstances, not imagine, but know that, based on the facts, you had a right to sue anyway.
But you
had as well.
Ed, to that point, let's just break it down to our listeners. How is it used and abused? So you're arrested. You're arrested for no reason. You're a victim of excessive force or false arrest. Now you're in the precinct. You're like, my back hurt, my neck hurt, my arm hurt. I can't feel my fingers. I want to go to the doctor. And guess what? The officer comes over to you and says, well, look, man, if you want to go to the hospital, that means you're going to be here for another 10 to 12 hours. If you skip that hospital treatment, we can get you out in 5. We can get you out in 6. But if you go to the hospital, then we got to take you to the hospital, or we got to call EMT. Then they got to treat you. That's going to slow up your paperwork. And I know you really want to get out of here, right? So why don't you say, I don't want to go to the hospital, refuse medical treatment, and you sign off and write that on a piece of paper so they have it documented so they can't be liable. You stay the extra 10 to 12 hours anyway, because there's no guarantee you're going to get out in 5 anyway. They still put you down for the late bus.
So you mean they lied to you?
You mean that's right. They lied to me. Imagine that, right? And then you go see the judge. Let's just say you get released, and now you go to the hospital. And what is one of the headaches we have to deal with as litigants? Well, he refused medical treatment. She refused medical treatment. And so that's a critical analysis, which I clap my hands to, the fact that it is now a right. Like, you can't not do this. But that was an abuse that, if you're not really thinking about it, you would think that that's a throwaway. Like that's important. Like, that's more important than some of the other stuff that I see. That's like really important, because they use that as a tool to threaten you not to evoke your rights. And who wants to be stuck in a cell another 24 hours, another 17 hours? Who wants to be handcuffed to a bed another 6 or 7 hours because they want to get you? You want to get the hell out of there. But that is reform. And we need to pinpoint what is and what isn't, what is fact and what is fiction.
Or what's fluff.
or what's fluff?
Yeah, no, and you know, people say those medical records really don't lie. That's some of the strongest evidence you could have whenever it comes to these incidents. If you have a medical record showing, you know, bruises, actual injuries that have been diagnosed or reviewed by a doctor and go on to a medical record, you know, that's big. Not to mention just from a health perspective, you know, if somebody's injured that they need that attention, and God forbid, they may suffer either further damage to themselves or possible death. So,
And I throw one more thing out there. One more thing out there is that, and this is, and look, people, we're giving it to you real because we've been there real time. And I'm there every single day, or every other day, or every 3 days now is Corona, or every maybe 5 days now is Corona, maybe every 7 days, but I'm there, right? And so what happens is that the victim comes into the hospital, and hopefully now with all the reform and all the awareness, the doctor won't do what they normally do, which is they'll speak to the police officer. What happened? What you think the police officer is going to say? And guess what? That goes down on the medical record as if the victim is saying what happened. So when they go, what happened? And the police officer says, well, he ran and he tripped and he skinned his head. Guess what? They write down in the medical record, patient ran, tripped, skinned head. For real, y'all? Is that how we doing it? That's how it's played? You know what I mean? How they used to do back in the day when you slap box. It's all fun until you get slapped in the eye, right? Then when you get slapped in the eye, it's a real fun.
Yeah, right?
It's all good. It's all good. We can slap box all day. We can throw up the smitties all day. When you get slapped in the eye, then it becomes like, oh man, you slapped me in the eye. Now all of a sudden you got a real fight, right? And everybody's going, ooh, you got an eye jammy.
Yeah, that's right. I've been in one of those.
Shout out to my man Fat Dow, who he and Cracker Barrel Dow, we slap box, and next thing you know, it became a real fight back in the day. Shout out to my man right here. But now, hopefully, those who are part of being awoke and in movement in another profession, maybe they won't go to the police. Maybe they'll go to the patient and say, what happened? Oh, he assaulted you. Oh, that's what he did. And hear it from the patient. Don't skip over the narrative when it says, what is the patient's chief complaint? And you just skip down, he was assaulted. No, be detailed. He had 2 bruises to the back of his head. He said he was messed up. Because that is important. That is transparency. That'll get us to the finish line.
And I think that's something that the average person really wouldn't know, that this is a part of anything that an attorney would review or would be important in the case. They just know somebody got in trouble, they got hurt somewhere along the line between their arrest and getting to the hospital. So highlighting this and having this conversation really reminds people that, God forbid, someone that you know and love gets arrested, something happens, tell them to go to the hospital. Like, that's one of the tips that we've given today, is do not refuse medical attention, because to Ed's point and to Royce expounding on that, you need those records. So go to the hospital, even if it takes another 12, 21 hours, whatever they're telling you, don't listen to that, because you need that, and that could actually help your case. And once you get there, make sure you speak up best you can, because it depends on the condition you're in, but speak up so that the doctor can really write down. And I don't know, is it okay for the patient to say, can I see what you wrote, doc? I don't know if that's allowed, but you know.
What's even better is, since we're talking about not a movement, but life, and everybody wants to get back to the Black cause, is that folks in other professions do their job with the understanding that I need to hear from the patient as to what happened, and let me write that down. And a majority of times, my clients don't refuse medical treatment. They want to go, but the officers will wait you out and wait and wait and wait and wait. And that EMT takes for days to the point where then they say, you know what? I don't want to go. Just take me to central bookings. And next thing you know, you don't have the medical records that you need. It is a battle of endurance. It is a mindset that you have to have, that once this goes down, I'm going to see it all the way to the end, and I'm going to take care of the aftercare after that. So let's get it right, y'all.
Absolutely. And shout out to Nathan, who's watching, and he said Cracker Barrel on the shout out. So,
yeah. There we
we
go.
appreciated that. And, Ed, you were breaking down so much of it, and we probably have to do a part two because there's a lot that's happening. And we didn't even touch on some of the other things that are coming out from the federal government, what's coming out from Governor Cuomo. We just touched on New York City as an example with some of the things that are happening here. And our Black and brown communities, we're the ones that are experiencing these things in real time every day. So we can't, as Roy says, miss the opportunity to make this a long-standing lifestyle change. The reform can't just be for a moment. Movement, that's all subjective and how you want to describe it, but we need to keep moving and keep this top of mind for reform and change.
And as thinking minds think, we need to think about supporting those that are within the police department that want to say the right things. There needs to be more conversation about that.
Mm-hmm. And
absolutely. Those individuals need to be supported. They need to be applauded. You've been having a number of members of NYPD, current and retired, who have been calling for reforms for quite some time, many of them harassed and hurt by their, willingness to be vocal about the reform that needs to take place. We definitely need to look at seizing the time, especially this time. Keep in mind that a number of these reforms, you had activists calling for these reforms for years, and now all of a sudden with this incident and the visibility that it received, now it's finally created the impotence and the urgency to allow many of these reforms to go into place. And trust me, even with these reforms, we have to look at them closely because they are the product of negotiation. I'm sure people were asking for more radical reform, and this is what was settled on to allow somebody to have a soundbite, without, maybe causing too many problems or causing too many critics to rise up out of the, out of the wings or the shadows, so, all of these need to be watched closely, what they're going to look like once they are implemented and in effect. Next week, I'm hoping we talk about a lot of the proposed changes that have come out of the Congress and now the Republicans seem to have their own spin legislation to try to maybe halt some of that progress by coming up with their own bill. So, it's going to be, it's definitely an interesting time. Absolutely.
And I would say to that a couple of things. We talked about early on, or at least not today, but in many of our other episodes, the face of change. We got to still look at that face of change. We have to still analyze what that means because the battle has only begun. The belt is going to tighten, believe me. For every step that we take forward, there's people out there that say, you know what, let me pull that belt because you're stepping too far ahead. And folks who know me and know their history, they know exactly what I'm talking about. There is no free cheese in here. There's going to be a swing back. And you mentioned it just so slightly, Ed, with the Republicans. Whatever you want to name them, they don't even have to be Republican. They could be nameless.
Right.
That is going to be some what we call backwash. You know what I mean?
It's called defunding the police and try to scare people into believing that the advocates are calling for the total abolition of any cops whatsoever, and that you're going to have to get your own shotgun and protect yourself. Like, really, man? That's where we're going with this. We use it skill Black community. Well, what if you had no cops? What are you going to do then?
What we're going to do then is that we all going to put our applications in for our weapons, and we're going to invoke our Second Amendment right, and then we're going to see how that legislation change. We're going to
all of a sudden. Well, we didn't mean that.
That's right. You got to be 5'8", and you got to make sure you have no gray hairs. There's going to be all type of requirements that come on that to make sure that we don't get a piece of the bacon. You know what I mean?
Well, that's a whole nother show.
I'm not bacon
to that.
I love bacon, bro.
Yes, we do. But what's important for us to remember, especially for today, is just don't take things as at face value. Analytical thinking requires you to do a little research, requires you to dig a little deeper, to find out what was before and how much has really changed. How does this impact our community? What does that mean when we talk about the legal meeting the cultural? That we need to tell baby and them certain things that will happen if it goes down in the hood, right? Because that's where we're targeted. That's where these things happen. Something happens, something as simple as asking for medical attention. We might think it's simple. We might think it's, oh, that's a no-brainer. But to Royce's point, if a young person is scared, they want to go home, they don't want to be locked up. This is like traumatic as it is. They might opt out of something that could actually